Hey there, interwebs, and welcome to Spooky Season 2025. Last year, we looked at Bram Stoker's novel Dracula as an early feminist piece. In addition to being a seminal work in the vampire fiction subgenre, arguably inventing the modern archetype, it also had some pretty interesting things to say about a woman's place in the world for those willing to read between the lines. This year, I'd like to look at those same themes in another novel, The Jewel of Seven Stars. Before I begin, however, I should probably introduce it. After all, just about everyone's heard of Dracula, but what's The Jewel of Seven Stars? This novel, also by Bram Stoker, is to mummies what Dracula is to vampires. Just as the former wasn't the first work of vampire fiction, having been preceded by Carmilla and Varney by several decades, but became a progenitor of the modern vampire subgenre, so too was Jewel one of several influential early milestones for the horror genre today. It begins as a paranormal mystery novel with a romantic B-plot, but as the investigation progresses, there grows a suggestion that a mummy looted from Egypt is not the lifeless corpse it seems to be, and the tone gradually shifts with spooky results. The story's narrator, a barrister named Malcolm Ross, has a crush on Margaret Trelawney, who is often named as the novel's true protagonist, and she feels likewise about him. That's why she calls upon him when her father, the Egyptologist Abel Trelawney, suddenly falls mysteriously ill. Skipping ahead a bit, he's basically in a supernatural coma which has something to do with one of the countless ancient artifacts he's collected throughout his career, and once the main characters figure out that magic's afoot, the police detective, who was set up like he was going to be a major character, taps out and the rest of the novel becomes a gothic horror thriller in earnest. The novel was first published in 1903, 6 years after the publication of Dracula, but a second edition with a revised ending was released in 1912, and this version is much more readily available to modern audiences. On that note, I've put a link in the description to Gutenberg.org, where you can read the novel for free, and, as was the case with the Dracula essay, I recommend you read the book before watching the rest of this video, because spoilers, obviously. Alright, enough preamble. Let's jump into the meat and potatoes with Chapter 1, which begins with the following passage. In that blissful solitude, the young girl lost the convention of her prim, narrow upbringing, and told me in a natural, dreamy way of the loneliness of her new life. Once more, the wisdom of my manhood and the experience of my years laid themselves at the girl's feet. It was seemingly their own doing, for the individual I had no say in the matter, but only just obeyed imperative orders. That's Chapter 1, Paragraph 2, so you can see that we start as we mean to go on. The male narrator swiftly yet subtly introduces the dual themes of a woman escaping from patriarchal mores and masculinity becoming subservient to her. Through specific phrasing, he contextualizes this event not as a male character deferring to a female character, but of manhood itself yielding to imperative orders. That's how the first chapter begins, and this is how it ends. She turned away. I could see that she was crying quietly. It was evident to me that even in the midst of her trouble and anxiety, there was a chagrin that she knew so little of her father, and that her ignorance had to be shown at such a time and amongst so many strangers. That they were all men did not make the shame more easy to bear, though there was a certain relief in it. Trying to interpret her feelings, I could not but think that she must have been glad that no woman's eyes, of understanding greater than man's, were upon her in that hour. Did you catch that? A woman's perception or eyes is of greater understanding than a man's, or, in other words, women are wiser, perhaps even more fit to rule, as suggested by the aforementioned opening flashback, which is going to become a running theme of this novel. Maybe I'm reading too much into things, though. This is, after all, only the first of 19 chapters. It's not like the entire thing is about a woman's proper place in society and the timeless battle of the sexes as it pertains to rulership, right? Moving right along, we come to Chapter 2, wherein a letter is found from Abel Trelawney to his daughter containing explicit instructions on what to do if he should fall into a magic coma. Part of these instructions is that there should always be someone watching over him, and there should be added one other watcher or attendant at hand of the opposite sex. Understand that it is of the very essence of my wish that there should be, awake and exercising themselves to my purposes, both masculine and feminine intelligences. Never mind why, but this does suggest more directly that gender will play an important role in the story going forward. This chapter also begins a trend of older male characters having to ask the young female character for her permission to do their jobs, but more on that later. For now, let's set the central theme of feminism on the back burner while we take a closer look at the central characters. Malcolm Ross, as previously mentioned, is the first-person POV narrator of the story, but he's not really the protagonist, in my opinion. His character lacks emotional depth beyond devotion to Miss Trelawney, and undergoes no arc throughout the narrative. His love interest Margaret has a much stronger claim on the title of main character, but she must also share this role, amongst other things, with the mummy herself, Queen Tera. So, who is Queen Tera, you may ask? Let's look to some hardcore info-dumping provided in Chapter 11 for an answer. Queen Tera was of the 11th or Theban dynasty of Egyptian kings which held sway between the 29th and 25th centuries before Christ. She succeeded as the only child of her father, Antef. She must have been a girl of extraordinary character as well as ability, for she was but a young girl when her father died. Her youth and sex encouraged the ambitious priesthood, which had then achieved immense power, but King Antef had suspected some such movement and had taken the precaution of securing to his daughter the allegiance of the army. He also had taught her statecraft and had even made her learned in the lore of the very priests themselves. Thus the princess had been brought up amongst scribes and was herself no mean artist. Many of these things were told on the walls in pictures or in hieroglyphic writing of great beauty, and we came to the conclusion that not a few of them had been done by the princess herself. It was not without cause that she was inscribed on the stele as protector of the arts. But the king had gone to further lengths and had had his daughter taught magic by which he had power over sleep and will. She had been an apt pupil and had gone further than her teachers. Her power and her resources had given her great opportunities, of which she had availed herself to the full. She had won secrets from nature in strange ways, and had even gone to the length of going down into the tomb herself, having been swathed and coffined and left as dead for a whole month. Indeed, there was everywhere a symbolism, wonderful even in a land and an age of symbolism. Prominence was given to the fact that she, though a queen, claimed all the privileges of kingship and masculinity. In one place she was pictured in man's dress, wearing the white and red crowns. In the following picture she was in female dress, but still wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, while the discarded male raiment lay at her feet. Perhaps the most remarkable statement of the records, both on the stele and the mural writings, was that Queen Tara had power to compel the gods. That's a lot of words, even after my omissions, so allow me to summarize. Queen Tara was what we in the 21st century would refer to as the HBIC, or head bitch in charge. It's also worth noting the usage of the phrase, her youth and sex encouraged the ambitious priesthood. This makes it clear that yes, Tara was a woman and a ruler, and this was considered unusual, both in the Theban dynasty when she was alive, and at the turn of the century when this novel is set. Her rulership, despite her gender, makes her, in Stoker's own words, extraordinary. Just because Queen Tara is the novel's most overt example of a woman in charge doesn't mean she's the only one, however. Let us compare her character to Margaret Trelawney. Tara was both a woman and a ruler in the patriarchal society of ancient Egypt, and her modern counterpart very much lives in one as well, namely Victorian England. Okay, technically it's the Edwardian era, but shut up. There is a subtle but telling moment in Chapter 7 which reveals the highly patriarchal nature of British society at the turn of the 20th century. Mr. Corbeck looked first at me, with a strong man's natural impulse to learn from a man rather than a woman, then at Miss Trelawney, with a remembrance of the duty of courtesy, and said, "Tell me all about it, how it began, and when." Later in that same chapter, the narrator reports, Miss Trelawney stepped over and laid her hand on his arm. I looked at her in amazement. All the passion and pain which had so moved her seemed to have taken the form of resolution. Her form was erect, her eyes blazed, energy was manifest in every nerve and fiber of her being. Even her voice was full of nervous power as she spoke. It was apparent that she was a marvelously strong woman, and that her strength could answer when called upon. This is part of an ongoing theme that Margaret, like Queen Tara, is rather exceptional for a woman in her position. In fact, it is strongly implied that Margaret Trelawney is the physical reincarnation of Queen Tara, and Chapter 14 ends with this musing on the latter. I take it that she had made arrangements for leaving the tomb when, after her resurrection, she should be a new woman, with a different personality, and less inured to the hardships that in her first existence she had suffered. Note the use of the phrase new woman, which was the term for the proto-feminists of the time, and a label which could certainly be applied to Miss Trelawney. Could this phrasing be a coincidence? Of course, but I doubt it, given how often Stoker referred to it in Dracula. The connection between Margaret and Tara is supported by the fact that she lives with her father in a male-dominated society, but due to the supernatural circumstances of the novel, Mr. Trelawney is incapacitated for approximately the first half of it, making her the acting head of household, and thus all of the other male characters, including doctors, lawyers, detectives, and historians, must first obtain her permission before doing anything as it relates to the home. I find it amusing that these respected men have to keep asking this young girl for permission to conduct their affairs. Mr. Corbeck is an Egyptologist with multiple degrees and doctorates and sufficiently feathered with diplomas to fly into even a sick room, not to mention decades of field experience, but he still has to defer to this 20-something woman upon his arrival in the narrative. He and the other men may be the experts in their respective fields, but she is the acting head of the household, and so she's the one who wears the pants. This makes it doubly ironic when these men later try to shut her out of proceedings to protect her delicate constitution, despite having just requested her permission to get involved in the first place. This isn't the first time an almost entirely male party has tried to shield the sole female member from goings-on in a Stoker novel, either. If you haven't seen last year's video about the feminist themes in Dracula, or if you need a refresher, know that Mina Harker is the most competent and effective character in that story, and, spoiler alert, every time her male allies try to leave her out of their plans to thwart Dracula because it would be too much for a woman's delicate constitution, which was the de facto cultural position at the time, it immediately comes back to bite them in the ass, or more accurately, neck. This recurring issue from Dracula also plagues the latter half of Jewel. While the former is an epistolary novel told from multiple characters' perspectives, the latter's singular narrator makes it slightly more subtle when this repeatedly occurs with Margaret Trelawney. Still, you can find instances of her being excluded on the basis of gender from conversations which really should involve her if you look for them. Case in point, Chapter 10 begins with Ross explaining, "We had arranged amongst us, before Dr. Winchester had gone home, that she was not to be brought into the range of the coming investigation. We considered that there might be some shock to a woman's mind in matters of apparent mystery. And in the words of her father in chapter 14, "What I want to consult you about now is this. Margaret and I disagree on one point. I am about to make an experiment, the experiment which is to crown all that I have devoted 20 years of research and danger and labor to prepare for. I do not want my daughter to be present, for I cannot blind myself to the fact that there may be danger in it, great danger and of an unknown kind. As to myself, I am willing to run any risk, but for my daughter to run such a risk, I am loath. Her young, bright life is too precious to throw lightly away, now especially when she is on the very threshold of new happiness." We can clearly see that when Mr. Trelawney is incapacitated, Margaret is in charge, and the esteemed men must act with her permission, just as the Theban priests had to do when Queen Tara ascended the throne following her own father's passing. But after Mr. Trelawney returns to consciousness, he and the other men attempt to bar Margaret from their proceedings, which they wouldn't be conducting without her earlier consent. Stoker wasn't a dumb guy. He had to be aware of what he was doing with this juxtaposition. So, what was he doing with it? Time for a little history lesson. At the turn of the 20th century, Western Europe was experiencing the phenomenon known as fin de siècle, literally the end of the century in French, but what we might call the end of an era. Part of this social transition was the emergence of the aforementioned New Woman. This early feminist movement was an unofficial social campaign in which middle-class women pursued social and sexual liberation by challenging the gender roles prescribed by society. Stoker was critical of the concept in his earlier works, but came to embrace it more over time, resulting in Jewel arguably being even more of a feminist piece than its predecessor, Dracula. The themes of female liberation and empowerment in this work are also more obvious than they are in Dracula. Not only is the supernatural character in Jewel a female ruler rather than an undead male assailant, but so is the main character. Ross, as I've already argued, doesn't undergo much of an emotional arc, but Margaret, however, goes from a timid, retiring, proper lady to an outspoken and imperious advocate for the rights of Queen Tara, not just as a deceased person, but as a woman, and more on that in a moment. As she finds strength in her femininity, rather than despite it, her male colleagues become increasingly concerned about her change, and even frightened of her at times. This reflects contemporary society's growing concerns about the New Woman. In the words of Dr. Iveta Yusova, director of Carleton College's annual Women's and Gender Studies in Europe program, by contesting and defamiliarizing the hegemonic Victorian definitions of gender and sexual identities, the New Woman further fueled the anxieties and fears that already circulated among the middle-class British population at the time. Looking back at Dracula once more, we can see a similar dichotomy between bad bitch Mina and her totally platonic girlfriend Lucy Westenra. The latter is the perfect virginal ingenue, the sort which would survive most novels of the era due to her chastity acting as a sort of morality-based plot armor, but she gets killed by the eponymous villain less than halfway through, and it's Mina who contributes most to Dracula's defeat, sending a clear message that being submissive and retiring won't protect a woman, but being feisty and taking matters à deux mains gets shit done. Just to hammer the point home like a wooden stake, the penultimate sentence of the novel is, "The boy will someday know what a brave and gallant woman his mother is." That's seriously the thought which Stoker chose to leave his readers with, and it does a fine job of passing the metaphorical baton to his next gothic horror novel, with its central theme of a woman taking charge. The conflict between old-fashioned patriarchal values and the New Woman comes to a head in the climax of Jewel, but before I say how, we must continue our little history lesson. Throughout the 19th century, Britain was gripped by a cultural craze known as Egyptomania, wherein anything and everything pertaining to ancient Egypt was haute couture. Egyptian influence could be seen in fields from art to science and everything in between, literature included. One of the pseudo-scientific pursuits enabled by the zeitgeist were so-called mummy unwrapping parties, no points for guessing what the main event of these get-togethers was. They were conducted under the thin guise of scientific inquiry, but were little more than public spectacles made only slightly unsavory by the fact that, that's a dead guy. A version of one occurs in the final chapter of this novel, entitled The Great Experiment, although not without some opposition. The chapter's titular experiment is an attempt by Trelawney et al. To resurrect Queen Tara by reuniting her soul, or Ka, with her corporeal body, which requires first unwrapping the cadaver. If that thought makes you feel icky, don't worry, you're not the only one. The story's most vociferous opponent of the procedure is, unsurprisingly, Margaret herself, who objects on the grounds that it would be improper for this group of men to so callously denude a woman, even a dead one. "Father, you are not going to unswathe her, all you men, and in the glare of the light? But why not, my dear? Just think, father, a woman, all alone, in such a way, in such a place. Oh, it's cruel, cruel!" She was manifestly overcome. Her cheeks were flaming red, and her eyes were full of indignant tears. "But oh, it seems such a horrible indignity to a queen, and a woman." In protest, Mr. Trelawney remarks, "They didn't have women's rights or lady doctors in ancient Egypt, my dear," which seems to me to be rather hitting the nail on the head. Despite his daughter's objections, Trelawney and his associates unwrap Queen Tara until she lies completely nude upon the table, at which point Ross remarks, "I felt a rush of shame sweep over me. It was not right that we should be there, gazing with irreverent eyes on such unclad beauty. It was indecent, it was almost sacrilegious, and yet the white wonder of that beautiful form was something to dream of. It was not like death at all. It was like a statue carven in ivory by the hand of a Praxiteles. All the pores of the body seemed to have been preserved in some wonderful way. The flesh was full and round, as in a living person, and the skin was as smooth as satin. Ross's narration continues to gush about how hot and nude this dead chick is, because male gaze, obviously, but I think you get the picture. It is only brought to a halt when Margaret has had enough and throws a sheet over Queen Tara. Once the body and the ritual space are prepared, the men conduct their magic science experiment, and this is where things diverge depending on which edition you're reading. In the original 1903 ending, spoiler alert, it is implied that Tara is returned to life, but all of the men save for Ross, who was out of the room at the time, are killed in the process by some supernatural force. In the revised 1912 ending, which some scholars deny Stoker even wrote, the experiment, different spoiler alert, is an unqualified failure. Tara's hitherto perfectly preserved body is reduced to a pile of dust, but at least no one dies, and Ross marries Margaret a few years later, although it is partly implied that maybe Tara's Ka has taken over Margaret's body, leaving the reader to wonder just how much of Ross's eventual bride is still Margaret, and how much is now Tara. Riddle for the ages, that one. Anyhow, I kinda prefer the 1903 ending, and not just due to my reflexive aversion to romantic subplots, but because the supernatural Psi magic ritual actually succeeds in creating an undead mummy, but at a terrible cost. If that's the version we go with, then the story about an exceptional woman's place in the patriarchy ends with the tacit message, respect women's bodily autonomy or perish, and honestly, I think that's a moral we can all get behind. In summary, Bram Stoker's The Jewel of Seven Stars is rife with feminist ideas and themes as they relate to fin de siècle and the start of a new era, and you're more than welcome to read it and find them for yourself. Having now covered vampires and mummies, maybe next year we can take a look at feminist themes in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Gee, real needle in the haystack there. Anyway, thanks for watching, y'all. Have a super spooky season, and as always, have a nice day. I can also say with nigh on absolute confidence that Bram Stoker either owned a cat or was close friends with someone who did. Just listen to how Margaret Trelawney describes her own pet kitty, Silvio. Father does not like animals about the house unless they are dead and mummified. Even my poor kitten was only allowed in the house on sufferance, and though he is the dearest and best conducted cat in the world, he is now on a sort of parole and is not allowed into this room. As she was speaking, a faint rattling of the door handle was heard. Instantly, Miss Trelawney's face brightened. She sprang up and went over to the door, saying as she went, "There he is. There is my Silvio. He stands on his hind legs and rattles the door handle when he wants to come into a room." She opened the door, speaking to the cat as though he were a baby. "Did him want his mother? Come then, but he must stay with her." She lifted the cat and came back with him in her arms. He was certainly a magnificent animal, a chinchilla grey Persian with long silky hair, a really lordly animal with a haughty bearing despite his gentleness, and with great paws which spread out as he placed them on the ground. Whilst she was fondling him, he suddenly gave a wriggle like an eel and slipped out of her arms. He ran across the room and stood opposite a low table on which stood the mummy of an animal and began to mew and snarl. Miss Trelawney was after him in an instant and lifted him in her arms, kicking and struggling and wriggling to get away, but not biting or scratching, for evidently he loved his beautiful mistress. He ceased to make a noise the moment he was in her arms, and in a whisper she admonished him. "Oh, you naughty Silvio, you have broken your parole that Mother gave you. Now say good night to the gentleman and come away to Mother's room." As she was speaking, she held out the cat's paw for me to shake. As I did so, I could not but admire its size and beauty. "Why," said I, "his paw seems like a little boxing glove full of claws." She smiled. "So it ought to. Don't you notice that my Silvio has 7 toes, see?" She opened the paw, and surely enough there were 7 separate claws, each of them sheathed in a delicate, fine, shell-like case. All I can say in response to that is, "Aw, beans!" And yes, Silvio is a polydactyl cat with 7 toes on one paw, just as Queen Tara had 7 fingers on one hand, hence the unusual fist symbol in the video thumbnail.